Sergey just told us why we should be a little bit worried about Russia. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to try to convince you why you should be terrified of China. And as Corey mentioned yesterday, this is derived from a book that I've just written with my friend Mike Beckley, which will be out in a couple of months. And the argument that we make, I hope, is a little bit more counterintuitive than the normal let's all go hyperventilate about China type argument, because our argument is that China is in fact more dangerous than we might think, but actually because it's weaker than we might think. And so the typical framing around the China issue is that China is this impressive rising power. And yes, there are a lot of ways in which this is true. The economic growth since the late 1970s has been phenomenal by any standard. China has been engaged in one of the largest peacetime military buildups in history over the past 25 years, and it continues apace today. Anywhere you look, you see Chinese companies that are trying to wire the world for 5G telecommunications. You see China insinuating itself into the leadership of existing international institutions or creating its own. There's thing after thing after thing you can point to that indicates that China is a power on the make. And in fact, China has developed an extremely ambitious grand strategy that it's aimed, I think, at four things of progressively greater ambition. And the first thing is the thing that every authoritarian power wants, which is to stay in power, to avoid being overthrown or being pushed out in some way or another. And every decision that Xi Jinping makes, because when we talk about China these days, we really are talking about Xi Jinping, is made with that goal in mind. The second goal might be thought of as making China whole again. When Xi Jinping looks at the map of China, he sees a different China than we see when we look at it. He sees a China that encompasses all of the South China Sea, that encompasses Taiwan, that encompasses Hong Kong, that encompasses a variety of pieces of territory that China disputes with a number of its neighbors. The third objective might be thought of as Asia for Asians. Think of this as the sphere of influence in the Indo Pacific, where China is able to exert preponderant influence because the United States has been kicked to the margins. And you can see this through a variety of the efforts that Beijing has made to weaken and attenuate U.S. alliances in the region. And then the fourth one, which is perhaps the most controversial, but I think there's significant evidence to support this now, I think it's quite clear that Beijing wants to be the primary, the global power within another 20 or 30 years. And so when China talks about the great national rejuvenation, when it talks about the community of common destiny, when it uses these innocuous sounding phrases, what it's really describing is an international order that has been fundamentally transformed because Chinese power has surpassed American power. And many of the arrangements that exist today, America's global network of alliances, for instance, have been weakened, if not rendered obsolete. And you can see this ambition in a number of the public statements that Xi Jinping and his officials make, these comments that the East is rising and the West is declining, the sense that China's time has arrived, that the wrongs of the century of humiliation are about to be put right. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find pretty pervasive anxiety. The future is not as bright as it may seem for the CCP. And in particular, China confronts two big problems that it really doesn't have a good way of solving at the moment. And the first is economic stagnation. The Chinese growth rate has basically been dropping significantly since about 2007, 2008. We used to have double-digit annual growth rates. Before COVID, the official rate was about 6%. Most people think it's more like 2 to 3 to 4%. And that includes lots and lots of unproductive growth, right? Building ghost cities, investing in infrastructure projects that will never make good. And so China really doesn't have a good way of reversing this because it's facing serious economic headwinds in a variety of fronts. It's running out of resources. Its land and its water are being depleted. It's heavily dependent on foreign energy resources that have to traverse dangerous supply lines to get there. It's running out of people. China's about to experience one of the worst peacetime demographic collapses in history in the coming decades. It's reverted from a smarter form of authoritarianism to a dumber form of authoritarianism, in which issues like economic growth and innovation are increasingly subordinated to Xi Jinping's desire to exert absolute control over the political system. The period of economic reform has been over for about a decade at least. And when China looks out at the world, and this is the second factor, it's facing an increasingly hostile world. And we refer to this as an issue of strategic encirclement. There was a long period of time, about 30 or 40 years, when China's rise was welcomed and enabled by the most powerful democratic countries in the world. My own country, the United States, played an extremely important role in this, but others did as well. And the idea was that by helping China rise, by helping make it more economically powerful, more globally integrated, we would change China's trajectory over time. Those expectations, of course, have not borne out. And so now when China looks out at the world, it looks out at an international system where more and more countries are pushing back against its rise. Look at the way that basically every advanced democracy in the world has walled off its telecommunication systems from Huawei and ZTE at this point. Look at the thousands of tariff barriers that have been put in place against Chinese goods over the last 10 to 15 years. Look at the way that military spending is increasing in countries throughout the Indo Pacific, and look at the way that countries throughout the Indo Pacific and beyond are coming together in these overlapping coalitions that are either explicitly or implicitly aimed at checking Chinese power. AUKUS, the Quad, closer U.S.-Japan defense cooperation on potential contingencies in the Western Pacific. All of these are going to create a strategic environment that is increasingly hostile to Chinese influence and Chinese expansion in the coming years. You're seeing this in the tech world as well, the creation of informal semiconductor alliances that are basically meant to ensure, although no one will say this explicitly, that China is never able to catch up in this crucial technology that's really the lifeblood of modern innovation. So I think it's actually wrong to think of China as a rising power. It is a risen power, and its military capabilities continue to grow very fast. It's certainly rising in that sense, but it really has to worry about its economic and strategic future, which I don't think looks so bright. And so this is why if you scrape below the surface, as I mentioned a minute ago, you see a lot of anxiety in Chinese circles. And I actually think that this is what makes China so dangerous. And so the conventional wisdom about what causes great power war is expressed in this idea of the Thucydides trap, that it's a rising power that overtakes an established power and that leads to war. But historically, the most dangerous revisionist powers, the most dangerous sort of powers that want to remake the international systems are the ones whose power has peaked and started to decline, the ones that start to worry that they have made all of these enemies and now they're not going to be able to overtake them peacefully. And so they become more willing to use force to achieve their objectives. You can make a strong case that this was what happened with Germany prior to World War I. Yes, Germany had destabilized the European system through its rise for about 35 years after unification in 1870. But the reason that German policymakers were willing to run such extreme risks in the July crisis in 1914 was that they feared decline. They realized that they had become encircled by the Triple Entente, that they themselves had provoked through their own behavior. And they were looking at a changing military balance that was pretty unfavorable in the coming years. I won't go into this for reasons of time, but you can make a similar argument about Japan in the 1920s and 1930s. And so if people ask, what are you worried about vis-a-vis China today? I'm not worried about waking up in a Sinocentric world 30 years from now. I don't think China has the power to accomplish that for some of the reasons that Corey talked about yesterday. I worry about China using force in the next 5 to 10 years to achieve the goals that it wants while it still thinks it has the ability to do so. There are a variety of areas where this is possible. The one that I worry most about, of course, is Taiwan. When Henry Kissinger went to China in 1971 and 1972, the Chinese leadership told him that, of course, Taiwan belonged to China, but that the Chinese leadership was willing to wait 100 years to see that wrong made right. That's not how Xi Jinping talks right now. He says that the Taiwan issue cannot be passed down from generation to generation, which a lot of China watchers interpret to mean it cannot be passed down to the next generation of Chinese leaders. In other words, it needs to be accomplished while Xi Jinping is in power, which is probably, we're talking about the next decade or so. And in fact, if you look at a variety of factors, my hunch is that Xi Jinping will be most tempted to use force against Taiwan really in the period between about 2024 and 2029. I think that this is when the military balance of power is going to be most favorable to China. China's military reforms will be complete then, at the same time that the United States is retiring a bunch of ships and planes that were built in the 1980s that now catch on fire because they're so old and can no longer remain in service. It's when China is going to be out of peaceful options for compelling unification with Taiwan because the context of Taiwanese politics becomes more and more hostile to this every year. And I think it's when Xi Jinping is going to be looking at the future and realizing that he only has a finite period of time in which to do this, in part because of the economic reasons I've talked about, and in part because the United States, Taiwan, and other countries are finally getting serious about the threat of Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific, and they're starting to make plans to strengthen the deterrence, to strengthen their capabilities in the region. Here's the problem. Those plans will bear fruit in the early 2030s on the current trajectory. That's likely to be too late. And so China is going to have a window of opportunity in the second half of this decade to try to use coercion to get what it wants. I think that this would be disastrous. I think it would be a major blow strategically if Taiwan were reincorporated into China, because it would blow a hole in the first island chain, which currently obstructs China's access to the Western Pacific. I think it would be a disaster technologically if you look at the role that Taiwan plays in semiconductor supply chains. And of course, it would be a disaster in the sense that it would extinguish the liberty of 24 million people in what is now a democratic Taiwan. And so I'll just wrap up by saying that we've been thinking a lot about preparing for a superpower marathon with a rising China. We need to be thinking about a decade-long sprint with a peaking China, because that's the problem that we confront today. Thank you.
What's worse, if China wins or if China loses?
It is infinitely worse if China wins. And so if China loses and you have to deal with an economically stagnant China 20 years from now, or a China that's confronting increasing difficulties in terms of maintaining control of restive provinces, that's bad. But a China that wins, a China that is able to reorder the Western Pacific to its liking, that would fundamentally change the nature of the world we live in economically.
But a China that is disappointed, desperate and dangerous, isn't that a worse option?
It's dangerous, certainly, right? But you can get to the same place by a China that is confident and rising. And so the question is not, the issue is really how do you strengthen your capabilities in the next 5 to 10 years so that an invasion of Taiwan does not look profitable, so that it does not look tempting, and thereby buy yourselves the time for some of the internal strains in the Chinese system to weaken China.
Is the Western response to China's ambitions today the right one?
It's headed in the right direction, and it's not getting there fast enough.
Faster? Better?
Faster and better on technological supply chains, faster and better on shoring up the military balance in the Western Pacific, faster and better in terms of deepening economic integration between advanced democracies so that you can decouple where you need to from China. Along a variety of these dimensions, people have the right ideas. The question is just whether we can summon the urgency.
Thank you, this fun.